dinosaurs probably were upright animals. You know, the famous Crystal Palace reconstructions, yes, they're very rhinoceros-like and extremely chunky, but they are not sprawling at all. And this is pretty obvious when you see the hips, and their hips are actually surprisingly like ours, in the sense that there's a nice big hole in the middle of the hips for the head of the thigh bone, the femur, to go into. And the femur, when you've got it, is basically a giant inverted L shape, so that it's got a very distinctive head at basically 90 degrees to the rest of the shaft, so that that can plug into that hole in the hip, and then the leg sits straight down and not sideways. And that was realised very early on, and so these immediately became upright, standing and walking and potentially running animals.
That's pretty sweet. So we've discussed on the podcast before about how we've got this amazing thing called a bottom. And the bottom lets us stride, it lets us squat, it lets us do all of this unique movement. No dinosaur reconstructions I've seen have given them nice booties. I think I actually have seen dinosaurs in booties where they've got little shoes on. However, that's not what we're talking about.
That's different.
They don't have glutes in the same way that we do.
No, we don't. Though, of course, actually, few animals do, or at least not in quite the way that we do. But yeah, so like all other reptiles, what dinosaurs, well, I was going to say snakes aren't really doing this, obviously, for a different thing. Like other legged reptiles, there are some leg muscles that attach onto various bits of the pelvis and will help move the legs backwards and forwards. But what's really doing it is, I'm sure we've mentioned these before, but this thing called the cordofemoralis. So these massive muscles that attach from the cauda, which is the tail, to the femora, so the cordofemoralis. And so it's a huge block of muscle that attaches on the tail to the back of the femur.
And the femur is the upper thigh bone. It's your thigh bone, isn't it? Just making it clear, because some of us, we know the leg bone attaches, but it's leg bone.
To the knee bone, and the knee bone attaches to the shin bone, yeah.
The big long one you don't want to snap.
Yeah, don't do that. So all muscles can do is contract. So when they contract, they get shorter. And what that does, therefore, is then pull that femur back. But if the foot is in contact with the ground and you pull the leg back, that will push the animal forwards. So their big drive for walking are these cordofemoralis muscles. And they're absolutely enormous. I mean, they can reach happily a third or even halfway down the tail, even in really big things like sauropods, which means you're talking about a block of muscle that can be, 6, 7, 8 meters long. Just really quite a big block.
That's like 4 of me.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
And so when that contracts, that's going to have really quite a lot of power to it, but then you're shifting a really big animal.
Is that why you get the tail swish when they're moving? Would you get a tail swish? Am I thinking that right? Because it'd be pulling on one side of the tail.
Yeah, so you are going to get a bit of that as a result. There's probably some more complicated things going on with tail stabilisation in places, because every time you get movement of bits that are not you, as it were, that's kind of wasted energy. So animals are usually trying to minimise this. But yes, you're probably going to get a wave propagating down the tail as a result of this. I've actually got a paper in review at the moment, which in part talks about tail stabilisation. And hopefully it may even be out by the time this podcast comes out, in which case I'll be desperately attaching a link to it. Yeah, so that's the big thing of kind of how they're moving. And of course, for the bipedal animals, so basically all your theropods and quite a chunk of the ornithischians and some of the early sauropodomorphs, that's the majority of their locomotion, because they're walking just off their hind legs, so their arms aren't really doing anything. For the quadrupeds, the amount that their arms do varies enormously. So even among some of the really big sauropods, they clearly have massive legs and actually, not weedy arms, because obviously there's an awful lot of animal there and an awful lot of weight, and they need some drive. But they simply don't have the attachment points for similar kind of muscles. Their shoulders, so their shoulder blades in particular, the scapulae, they are attached to the body, but they're not fused to this giant block of bone in the way that the pelvis is, which makes things kind of more awkward for exactly that kind of point of drive. There's the risk of things moving around. It's easier to tear stuff if you put too much strain on it. So in most things, the legs are either doing all the drive if you're a biped, or actually most of the drive, even if you're a quadruped.
Is that true of like modern mammals as well, like bison and cows and things?
It's rather more even on us, I think, at least in part because we have much smaller pelvises. So I think even things like elephants actually only have 3 or 4 vertebrae, so bits of the backbone, incorporated into the pelvis. So the pelvis itself, whilst there's a lot of bone there, but you compare that to like a comparable sized small sauropod or an ankylosaur or a ceratopsian, they'll have 7, 8, 9, 10 vertebrae attached to the pelvis. So the pelvis is a much bigger block of bone, which is much better held together. So they can put a lot more power through it.
That suggests to me that they could accelerate very quickly. Because if they've got this like massive great engine, I'm thinking of cars where you have like all the weight and stuff on the back, and then they could just accelerate really quickly.
There's long been an idea that things like the hadrosaurs and the iguanodons, the duck-billed dinosaurs, the iguanodontians, basically were walking around on all fours when they were slow, and as they accelerated up to top speed, would be running just on their back legs. And there's a couple of reasons to think that. So there are a bunch of lizards that do this, and as they accelerate, they actually go up onto their back legs.
I've seen them, they're hilarious.
Hadrosaurs are actually a really good example of where they have really quite weedy forelimbs. They are not particularly big, and they are not particularly powerful.
And iguanodons need to keep their like thumb claws clean.
Possibly. Don't think the orientation was likely a problem for them. But whether or not they did that, I don't know. I think there's been some real pushback on that in recent years, but certainly the idea, you can see where it came from, and I don't think it's a bad idea as such. And there's some other animals that do something similar. So wallabies and kangaroos, when they walk around slowly, they actually have a form of locomotion which is called pentapedal. Now, of course, they don't have 5 legs, they have a tail.
Yeah.
But what you'll see they do is they very obviously put their front legs down, which in this, again, same context, really quite small and not that strong. They'll put their front legs down and their tail down, and then lift their back legs up and swing forwards. And so they'll move as like a tripod and then a biped alternately. And then, of course, as soon as they start accelerating, they'll go on to just their back legs. And kangaroo rats and, hopping mice and various other things do exactly the same thing. So there are quite a diversity of animals which will shift their locomotion from 4 legs to 2, depending on quite what the situation is. So it's certainly not unreasonable.
It's a really bizarre thing, because I know they're doing it to save energy, but I've hopped around on my back legs in that motion, and it is really hard work. They must have all of this sort of like springy muscle or something to just absorb the impact.
Kangaroos, and I assume kangaroo rats, but and jerboas and gerbils and other things, but kangaroos certainly have been studied, and they are very unusual in that the faster they go, the more efficient they are. For exactly that reason, they are extraordinarily springy. And so when they are moving quickly, they have more momentum, which means when they land from a jump, they are compressing those tendons and things which will give them some spring. And then, of course, as they jump off again, they get that spring return. But if they're not moving very fast, they can't compress them much, and so they don't get much return. And so they're actually more efficient moving at like 40, 50 miles an hour than they are at like 10, 15 miles an hour. Which is a really good way of travelling long distances fast and efficiently. So yeah, kangaroos are extraordinary. They were really getting off the subject of dinosaurs.
Oh yeah, but I was just thinking, hadrosaurs. Have we found any with really big feet? That's
no. But actually, going back, people did suggest that some of them jumped. I think in Conan Doyle's Lost World, there's a description of the megalosaur or allosaur bounding like a kangaroo, and that's certainly been reconstructed and suggested as such for a number of them. I think off the fact that they had massive hind legs and a really big muscular tail, but they're really not set up to bounce, unfortunately.
Shame, wouldn't it be lovely if somebody discovered that T-Rex bounced? That would be the most amazing sight, because it's got the little arms.
It's got the little, yes.
And they had a pouch.
And a big head.
Oh, it would be a reasonable understanding if you had, a little herd of hadrosaurs and you had a T-Rex sneaking up and one of them was on guard and spotted, they would all run, but they'd all run and they'd all stand up and then skedaddle. Yeah,
the idea is as basically as they accelerate, they kind of lift up, and they're in a similar position to some of those lizards in the sense that if you look at the centre of mass, so in other words, if you average the entire animal and see where is that I was going to say physical point, but I mean physical in the sense of physics. It's a calculated point. Where does that sit in the animal? And in things like hadrosaurs, and indeed a lot of things, again, including a lot of the big sauropods, it's either at or just in front of the pelvis. So in other words, the center of all of the weight is over the back legs. It is not somewhere in the middle of the animal. Now, that's true of almost all things to a degree, because the lungs are at the front, and actually that's a surprisingly big cavity with, very little mass at the front. But for, big quadrupeds, like elephants and rhinos and buffalo and stuff like that, that centre of mass is going to be quite a long way in front of the pelvis. It'll be closer to the hind legs than the front because of the lungs, but the absence of the tail is obviously going to make a big difference compared, got weedy little tails compared to dinosaurs. And so, with things like the hadrosaurs, that centre of mass is right over the hind legs. So you can see how, you can pivot the body around that axis effectively without stumbling or tripping or falling over, because you're not reliant on your hands being on the ground to avoid falling forwards.
And now I'm thinking, if you had, feathers, you could use it to sort of take off almost. It would be, you could actually have the extra lift helping you. But that might be a bit...
Well, that's sort of been suggested. So one of the kind of ideas for the origins of flight is, if you look at things like ostriches, they are flightless, but when they run, they will open out those big wings and use them to help them turn. And the idea that if you're a Microraptorine or Anchiornis or something very close to birds, but you can't yet fly, but if you're running along quickly and you stick your arms out and you get some lift, you effectively weigh less, which is quite a good way of running faster. And if you then flap them a bit, you would weigh even less. And if you flap one over the other, you could turn very, very quickly. I don't think anyone really buys that now as an argument, but there is a kind of point there that, yes, if you ran quickly and held your arms out, it's probably going to help.
The difference then between walking and running, if you're a hadrosaur, is 4 legs versus 2.
Potentially.
And because the gait changes when you run on other animals. Could they trot is basically what I want to know. Could they do the trot thing?
So my gait analysis is a little out of date, I know, but the one I learned when I was doing biomechanics as an undergraduate is that the definition of running is a fully suspended aerial phase, which basically means all of your limbs are off the ground at the same time. There are more modern and better definitions of that. So by that argument, Tyrannosaurus, for example, or at least adult Tyrannosaurus, because juveniles are probably quite a bit different, could not run. They probably had one foot permanently on the ground because they're just too big and heavy, and you don't want 7 tons of animal falling a distance, which is then giving you even more momentum onto a foot, and a foot that's actually not particularly big. They were probably permanently speed walking rather than running.
Mincing along, power walking, beautiful.
And obviously bigger and heavier things, and most obviously the sauropods, but also, big ceratopsians and stuff like this, ankylosaurs. They're never going to run in that sense where they get all 4 limbs off the ground. They could probably do something pretty close to it. Ceratopsians, maybe they could, and get into what we'd call a gallop for a quadruped. Again, 7-8 ton Triceratops. I'm struggling to think that they could genuinely do that. But it's at least a possibility. It is different when you're a quadruped.
It'd be terrifying. Imagine one of those things barreling at you.
Well, right. And so, bigger things tend not to be able to move quite as quickly, in part because they can't do this. Though what you can often lose in kind of raw power in that sense, you make up in size. So T-Rex is a good example of this, where it may not have been able to run, which we think of as being a faster gait than walking, but it's really big, which means it's got really long legs, which means that each stride actually carries it really quite a long way. And so, speed walking is not necessarily slow if you're taking enough strides and those strides long enough. Because that's ultimately what is the 2 factors which are moving you at a speed, is how often you are taking a stride, so your stride frequency, and how long those strides are, which is your stride length. So between those 2 determines almost everything.
So you're saying that if there were 2 dinosaurs having a fight and you needed to get a T-Rex involved, so you went to the enclosure with a flare and then you ran away from the T-Rex in order to get them to fight the other dinosaurs, you might not make it.
Yeah, so you'd probably get nailed, is the really short version, particularly if you try to do it in high heels on a wet cobbled street in the dark.
That'd be silly, wouldn't it?
But there's a more general point there, which is working out how fast dinosaurs could move is really, really hard, because there are so many unknown factors and the errors just balloon out of control very, very quickly. It's relatively easy to say how quick they were relative to each other, particularly if they're fairly similar builds, because you can work out the stride length and you've got an idea of how big and heavy they are and how much muscle they've devoted to their legs, which will give you a fairly good idea of their stride length and probably how powerful they are, and which give you at least a guesswork of stride frequency. And it's fairly easy to look at small, light things with really long legs and go, they're probably faster than the big, chunky things. But people are obsessed by having a speed. They always want to know, could it exceed X speed, or could they, what was the speed that they could reach? And the answer usually is either we don't know, or we've got a whole bunch of analyses and they give you this enormously wide range of answers, none of which are very informative, when the fastest speed is 5 times the estimate of the slowest speed. It's somewhere in there.
If you had a look at a lion skeleton versus a cheetah skeleton, would you know how much faster a cheetah could run and for how much longer than a lion? There's not that much difference.
Yeah, cheetahs are very obviously high-speed adapted, but that doesn't tell you quite how fast they'd get. And yeah, you're right, it gives you no idea of their endurance. Because so cheetahs are unusual as mammals in that they're actually got fairly hefty component of white muscle. Cutting a lot of corners and generalising a lot, there's red muscle and white muscle, and red is good for endurance and white is good for speed. And mammals are usually an awful lot of red muscle, and cheetahs are very weird in that they're an awful lot of white muscle, which of course exaggerates their speed even faster, because it means they can take extra strides quickly, but it means they get knackered super fast. And you just can't tell that from the skeleton, or in the case of dinosaurs, from the fossil record.
Let's look at stride lengths, because I just want to know how big the biggest stride was. I mean, these big sauropods, were they taking lots of little steps, or were they like taking massive, giant, all stretched out ones? Could we tell?
Yeah, but mostly because we've got footprints for things, which of course is a really nice, entirely independent line of evidence from finding skeletons. The problem with footprints is it's often very hard to say what animals they directly attach to. So I've mentioned before, one of the reasons that T-Rex is useful from a research point of view is it's pretty much the only big carnivore in its ecosystem. And actually even the large tyrannosaurs, there might be a bunch of species, but they're usually pretty close relatives. So when you find really big theropod tracks from a tyrannosaur-dominated environment, you may be able to go, oh, I'm not quite sure which of these 2 or 3 species it is, but they're all really similar to each other. And therefore you can go, right, I can take this, that this is almost certainly a tyrannosaur track. I can measure the length of the foot, and I can go and compare that to skeletons and go, okay, it's a foot of about this length, which means it's an animal of about this size, which probably weighs about this much, and its legs are this long. Right, so I can measure all these footprints, and I can measure this skeleton, and I can try and line everything up and see what's going on. And yeah, you can do that for quite a few things fairly reliably, and that actually lines up with the predictions that you'd make. So there's a famous biomechanics researcher called Neil Alexander, who died probably about 8 or 9 years ago, I want to say now, but he did some amazing stuff, and in the 60s, 70s and 80s was doing stuff like this. He was measuring dinosaur footprints, calculating the length of the foot, from that getting an estimate of the hip height and the stride length, and then calculating speed. So all very basic first principle stuff. A leg of length X tends to have a foot of length Y, which will tend to step at speed Z. But from that was calculating a whole bunch of speeds for various animals, and some of them had some fairly big errors on them in hindsight, but a lot of them as basic calculations have held up against much more complicated methods based on reconstructing individual bits of muscle and weight distributions and lung locations and balance. And you get a number right, roughly what he already said 30 years ago. Well, it's nice because it shows you that, that kind of validation is brilliant, actually, because it means you can go and do the quick and dirty method and know that your answer's probably quite reliable. Doing super complicated things to find out that the easy thing is right is extremely useful, because it means the easy thing is reliable and you don't need to worry about it.
It's not very sexy for publishing. Quick and dirty with lots of information is much more better for getting your papers published, surely, than going back and checking.
No, because journals like super sexy, overly complicated methods, even if they just produce the result that we already knew.
Good on dinosaur journals, that's what I say. I mean, doesn't it make a difference between, like, because if you're looking at a set of footprints, obviously you're thinking, oh, that's going to be in slippery mud, that they're leaving them. So it's a bit of a, you know... So
footprints are footprints are a minefield, which is possibly mixed metaphors, but actually might be quite a good one in this context. Often footprints are being laid down in stuff that is relatively soft. Not necessarily, which is a good start. We prefer looking at the ones which look like they're very good. And some are extraordinarily high fidelity. Like, you can see the individual scales on the underside of the foot in the impression.
Were they walking on the moon? What?
No, it's a really nice fine mud that probably wasn't too deep, and so the foot went in, lifted up. If it was a nice sunny day, that dried very, very quickly, and then some more mud washed in and just preserved it. And so, yeah, you have some trackways where you can see the individual pads, so just like the pads we have on our fingers, though they're more asymmetric. So ours, if you look at the palm of your hand, you basically have one bulge for each bit of your finger and the joints are in between. That's not how pads work on the feet of a lot of reptiles and birds. So the pads wouldn't line up with those joints very accurately. But anyway, the point is you can see those individual pads, you can see the scales, you can see the tips of the claws where they've touched into the ground. So obviously ones like that are absolutely brilliant. Some end up in stodgy mud and then they're all a bit squidged and you can't see very much. And then some are deep mud and have extraordinarily complicated patterns going on. So, anyone who's walked across somewhere like Weston-super-Mare when you've gone out into the mud.
If anybody's left a welly behind, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. You can see where you have walked. There is a trail of footprints, but none of them look like footprints at all because the mud has sucked back in. And so one thing you get in particular is there's a whole bunch of, like crow's feet-like footprints, almost like three lines meeting together and then a long line at the back for dinosaurs, which have been a puzzle and uncertain for a long time. A lot of people interpreted those as swimming tracks with just the toes scraping along the surface. There are genuine swimming tracks, but these are not they. And there's been some wonderful work, in particular done by a guy called Pete Falkingham, who's up at now Liverpool John Moores, where they got the whole block. So it's not just the little print that you can see on the surface, but that has gone deep into mud. And so what's happened is, if you can imagine, the foot has pushed down through the mud and then lifted up and forwards as you take the next step, and then all the mud's collapsed back in. But that has dried as a block. And by either cutting that block up physically or with some kind of, penetrating scanner, you can reconstruct the entire 3D nature of that and work out what the track and the trace of each individual toe has been. And then Pete and his colleagues have done some wonderful stuff doing this with like laser scans and like live video x-ray of guinea fowl and other birds walking through tiny glass beads and then tracking where every single bead moves around the foot as if it's a mud particle.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, it turns out you can basically backtrack dinosaur prints with a remarkable fidelity and see how they were moving through deep mud, which is really, really cool. Unfortunately, it's really awful for working out footprint size and shape. And another one, which is even worse, is you get a phenomenon known as underprinting.
Underprinting?
So if you can imagine lots and lots and lots of layers of mud or sand or whatever the sediments are, because that's often how things are laid out. You don't have just 10 metre thick of soil. There are lots of different layers. And you walk across that as a big heavy thing, your weight and the pressure of you stepping down is going to dissipate and it will push out in all directions. And so the top layer might leave a really nice crystal clear footprint, but the one below it is going to be a little bit bigger and, pushed out in every direction and a little bit less clear. And then again, and then again, and then again, and then again. And then that can all fossilise, and years later the upper layers can wear away, and then all you're left with are the underprints. And they're often A, very indistinct, and B, absolutely sodding massive, because they're not a real footprint. They're the dissipation wave of the effort of a footprint. There were sauropod tracks that came up in France, I want to say about 5 years ago now, but a while ago, not too long ago, not too recent, and they were described as the biggest footprints in history, and they reconstructed this dinosaur that was off the scale size because they had sauropod footprints that were like 1.5 meters, 2 meters across for an individual foot. Yeah. So, of course, they scaled this thing to the size of the Empire State Building, kind of, and it's like, no, that's obviously an undertrack, and that's the weight of a heavy sauropod on soft sand. It's blown out and blown out and blown out, and you're looking at 2 meters below the original footprint. And so now you've got a track that's, the 4 feet just touch each other at this point because it's not a real footprint. And that's one that happens all the time. And undertracks can still contain real information because you can just measure from the tip of the toe to the tip of the toe, and that will probably still give you a reasonable length of stride length and stuff. But particularly when people find indistinct tracks and start reconstructing giant animals off them, they are almost inevitably under tracks, and then everything goes horribly, horribly wrong. So kids, watch out for giant footprints in the news. They're not what they say they are.
So is there anything that we can learn from footprints that isn't, I suppose, just the distance between them, or, the way they put down their feet? I mean, what did they really tell us?
It can tell you things. There's stuff which we can't easily work out from skeletons that tracks can be a bit of a giveaway. So a famous one for this is the arm posture or forelimb posture of ceratopsians. So as we said, that they're a good example of an animal with great big legs and then relatively small front legs. And various reconstructions had the arms as kind of sprawling or nearly sprawling in them. And there was this kind of ongoing argument about whether or not, the forelimbs sprawled out sideways a bit like reptiles, or whether the elbows pointed backwards.
Do you know what this reminds me of? This sprawling thing is about how you do your push-ups. So you either do them to focus on your chest, so you have your elbows out, or you have your elbows in. So elbows out is sprawling, and elbows in, so they're touching the side, is more, four-legged, I suppose.
Yeah, though with sprawling, those arms would be pushed out sideways as well. You wouldn't have them under your shoulders; they'd be outside of your shoulders. But
that's how some people do their press-ups.
Oh boy, that's a lot of effort. Yeah, because you're not built to do that. So that was a discussion in the literature: is quite how are they holding their arms, and that has important implications for where the muscles go and how much drive you get from the forelimbs, and yada yada yada. And that was basically solved with footprints, because we found a bunch of footprints which were verifiable as belonging to ceratopsians and nothing else, and the little handprints were exactly in line with the hind legs, so they're not sprawled out sideways. They can't be, otherwise they wouldn't be leaving those tracks.
Or they could do what my cat does, which puts her paws together when she sits down and then walks like an ape the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Sprays out. Yeah, I don't think cats are a good model. They're liquids, aren't they? They're not really.
Yeah. That's the first problem. So things like that. I mean, a related one to the old tail dragging kind of trope of dinosaurs, so going back to them being reptile-like. There are actually a few tail drag marks. They do exist, but they're extremely rare for the obvious reason that the vast majority of the time the tail is held well clear of the ground. So that's another example of where trackways kind of show posture and locomotory style. And then a final one, which is a little bit different but particularly cool. There's a resting trace of a small theropod. Well, medium-sized. Small in the grand scheme of theropods, medium-sized in that it would give you or I a run for your money in a fight. From, I think it's New Mexico, I want to say, but North America, where this animal basically sat down.
Okay.
And so you don't just have the feet.
You've got a bum print.
Pretty much, actually, and handprints. So you've got the feet, but you've also got the kind of flat of the foot. So we walk on the flat of the foot; they walk on their toes. But they've got the toes and then the flat of the foot, so they've put the whole foot down effectively. Then there's a pair of handprints, which show that the hands are stuck in front of them and they were resting on those. And they're these nice pair of little kind of C shapes, because I think, as we discussed another one, in the birds one, dinosaurs don't flap their wrists over like rabbits or like they're playing basketballs, but they hold them with their fingers pointing inwards. And so this is exactly what you'd expect. They rest on the equivalent of our little fingers.
So they're almost, they're doing like, they're resting on their forearms, the whole of their forearms up to their little fingers. Nice.
And then finally, in between the feet, there's a big square block.
Oh.
And that's the pubis. So if you remember from the theropods, they have their bones come down at the front and fuse together to the pubes, and that sticks out below between the legs to about the level of the knees. So if they're squatting down on the ground, that's going to hit the ground. And it does, and we can see that. So we can see when they squat down and rest and sit as if they're just having a little bit of a rest, they flatten the feet, the pubis comes down and actually physically rests on the ground, and they will put their hands on the ground as well.
Oh, wow.
And so that tells you absolutely exactly how they are sitting.
Did it also put its chin down, so you got a little chin indent a bit further up, or did it have its head up?
It's not impossible. I think it's not preserved. So, unfortunately, it's one of those prints where I haven't seen the original, but I've seen some nice photos, and there's a really good description of it in the scientific literature. It's preserved easily well enough that all those features I've just said you can see. It's not preserved well enough that you can make out super fine details. And I don't think the area is that big. I'm sure they looked for this, and I can't remember what the paper says, obviously, off the top of my head. But I'm sure if there was any indication that the head had come down, that would have been included.
Just having a little rest. Well, no information about the tail either in this little resting situation.
No, I don't think so, actually. But again, that's not impossible that it would, because the base of the tail would still, there's a lot of muscle there. It could well be just the tip is touching or just the last bit is touching. And then if the ground is relatively solid, it might be touching. But if there's not enough weight pushing down, it's not going to leave anything. So maybe it didn't touch the ground. Maybe it touched the ground and didn't make a mark. Maybe it touched the ground and made a mark, but nothing preserved.
Maybe it was a very special dinosaur, which obviously, if you think about it, had its tail looping up and over and its head arching right back, and it was doing yoga. So it's a big O-shaped. It was a display. He's looking at me really sceptically. I don't think this is... I
was going to say, you should be used to this expression by now.
I know.
I think it comes up at least once an episode where Izzy has an idea.
So, aside from looking at the skeletons themselves and looking at footprints, I'm imagining there must be a load of paleontologists with, special toy dinosaurs all working out how to make them move. Oh, he's showing me one of his toy dinosaurs right now. But no, seriously, do people spend a lot of time just working out, building models in computers and stuff and just watching them move?
To a degree, yeah. I'm not sure they spend that much time on it, but it is definitely a growing field, because obviously you can do stuff with models that you can't do with skeletons and that you can't do with footprints. And obviously, ideally, everything actually comes together and is kind of independently or pseudo-independently verifies each other. And yeah, you can now walk into a museum and with a handheld laser scanner or even just a digital camera, take photos of a skeleton and drop that into a computer, and the computer will peel out the bones, and now you've got a complete articulated 3D skeleton for you, which is a hell of a good start. And one other thing that we can get from bones really effectively, actually, for a lot of the big and more important muscle groups, is where those muscles actually sit. They're called muscle scars, and they are physically scars on the bones where muscles attach, because they have great big ligaments on them, which leave these very distinctive roughened patches, often with a little rim around the edge, where those muscles go. So you can look at alligators and lizards and birds and see what kind of muscles they have where and where they attach. Then you can look at dinosaurs and do a comparison and try and work them out. The size and shape and position of those muscle scars will give you something of an indication of how big those individual muscle groups are, and therefore how strong they are. So if you've got a skeleton and you've got a fairly good idea of how much it weighs as a living animal, because we can reconstruct that and things like centre of mass and the lungs and yada, 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 and then you know where all the different muscle groups go and how big they are, you can give that information to the computer and basically say, make this thing walk or make this thing stand up. Wow. And see what it does. Because strange enough, animals tend to do things that are the most efficient and least effort way for basic movements like that. You can see at what point, if they start trying to run, do they overbalance, or does the weight fall in the wrong place, or the muscles aren't strong enough to move the leg faster than this, so they can't go faster than that.
So try and do a ceratops rearing up and having it fall backwards on itself.
Yeah, so that's probably going to be a tough one with the weight of the head and the fact that they are really well balanced above the pelvis. You'd have to really lift them up to do that, and that's probably not a problem very often. But yeah, this is a way of getting a model to tell you what you think it could do based on that parameter. And if you find, for example, that closely aligns with calculated speed from the leg length and from the spacing between footprints, then you've really got quite a nice set of, mutually supporting evidence that these are how fast they could run, and calculate things like acceleration and turning. And so we've got really quite a good idea of this. The problem that we have, which we have a lot of the time, unfortunately, is that this has been done rigorously for a couple of animals. Yeah. So we can tell you a huge amount about the acceleration and turning and top speed and other things of T-Rex, and very little about anything else that it might have been running after or might have been trying to get away.
What about Velociraptor? Because it's called Velociraptor. Was that as fast?
Yeah, so that's a good example of something where we haven't analysed it in great detail, but first principles means it looks pretty good. So we talked about stride length and stride frequency. So obviously the longer leg you have, the longer your stride length is going to be, particularly if you're a relatively small animal. Greyhounds have really long legs and they're not that big. They're going to go quick almost immediately because of that.
Greyhound versus pug, your money's on the greyhound, not the pug.
Yeah, right. But even for an animal of kind of similar height, greyhounds are really quite lanky animals. If you had, say, a German Shepherd or a Labrador, your greyhound immediately has proportionally longer legs and for a lighter animal as well. And the second thing is stride frequency. So you want to move those legs quickly. And so one thing you see on a lot of speed merchants is that the femur, and at the front the humerus as well, but we'll stick to the femur for now, is relatively short, which sounds counterintuitive when you're trying to make the leg move quickly. But if you think of the femur as the kind of start of a lever, and it's basically a lever moving through about 90 degrees. That's all it's doing. And then it's dragging the rest of the leg with it. So if you make that short, it's moving through the same arc in terms of degrees, but it's moving a shorter distance. And so if it's moving a shorter distance, you can make it move faster, which means you'll have more strides. So what you often see for the really fast animals is that the femur gets shorter as the leg gets longer. And that means they've got a longer stride and they've got more of them. And if you go and look at a horse skeleton, a horse femur is not that much bigger than a human's, despite the fact that horses are massively bigger than us and have hugely longer legs than us. And that's because they're taking a lot of strides, and those strides are long. And you put those two together and horses are really quick.
I always get obsessed in the gym because you're next to somebody short and you're both doing squats and they're doing them much faster than you ever can because they're diddy.
They haven't got the distance to move through.
Exactly. It's just not fair.
But that's a classic example of convergent evolution, where pretty much anything that is trying to move very fast will go for a long leg for its size and a short femur. And so as soon as you start seeing those characteristics showing up, you know that these animals are moving quick.
Does a long femur mean it's more likely to want to be jumping or something? A long one, because you get more muscle on the leg then.
Yeah, it will do various different things, and I'm not qualified to talk about that in too much detail. But and as ever, you've got all kinds of compromises going on. So we've bred horses in particular to be really quick, so that's going to manipulate those kinds of things. And exactly that, we've done the same thing with greyhounds. In the real world, there is always a trade-off between having endurance and having top speed, because, cheetahs fall exactly into this trap. They are extraordinarily quick, but if they don't catch something in the first 10 seconds, they ain't catching it because they've run out of puff before the animal. And even if they have caught it, if a lion or a leopard or a hyena shows up, they just sit there panting and can't actually do anything and either get killed themselves or have to wander off, and they haven't eaten. So even as a predator, that's a problem. And as a prey species, of course, it's a particular problem. If you can imagine small antelope in Africa, they have cheetah running after them that are happily doing 50 miles an hour. The problem is they also have things like hunting dog and hyena running after them who will do 15 to 20 miles an hour for an hour. So you yourself, I was going to say, as if you get to pick, natural selection, yada, yada, yada. You can't be too quick because then you'll have no endurance when the other predator turns up, and you can't focus too much on endurance or you'll never escape cheetah. That's
why you get them all twisty-turny and able to change direction really quick.
Yeah, that's part of it. But, it means that life is a compromise. And, if you live in an environment that changes regularly, for example, maybe it's very seasonal, and so every 6 months, you need to pack up and move 50 miles to somewhere else. well, then selection is going to favour both very high-speed sprints for when you're catching prey, but actually long-distance efficiency if you have to migrate every year. 2 or 3 times every year. So there's all these other trade-offs that we can't necessarily pick up. But if you, to go back to your question, attempt to answer it, if you just take Velociraptor as an animal, it is very lightly built and has pretty long hind legs. It's going to be pretty quick. It doesn't look like a super sprinter, but at the same time, it's going to be one of the faster things out there. And actually, that's a quite nice point in that, so calculations of T-Rex speed go up and down all the time, and at the moment, they're relatively low. And people are like, it's not very quick. It's like, well, it doesn't have to be if the things it's chasing aren't very quick. And doubly so if it's more of an endurance runner, which T-Rex certainly was. You just have to keep up enough that whatever you're after is still in your eye line and wait for it to tire out.
So do they run like birds then? Are they running like an ostrich, or are they running more like we do? And is there a difference? Because I seem to remember ostriches' knees go a weird way.
Yeah, so everyone says that birds have their knees backwards. That's a really common trope, is that birds have backward knees.
But are their knees their ankles?
Right. So if there are basically three main joints. You've got your hip, you've got your knee, you've got your ankle. What you actually see in birds, so when we stand upright, and if a dinosaur stood as upright as it could, kind of on tiptoes, your femur, your thigh bone is pointing virtually down. For the dinosaur, they point a bit forwards, but more down than forwards. And then your tibia, so your shin, and your lower leg is pointing slightly back, and then the ankle and the foot is pointing more or less forwards. And with those guys, they're kind of on tiptoe, so they've got an extra joint between the base of the toes and the rest of the foot. That's kind of their normal standing posture. What birds have is their femur points almost entirely forwards. It's like at 90 degrees. It's parallel to the ground, not perpendicular to it. So it's pointing straight towards the head. The kind of reason for that is they've got rid of the tail. So they don't have these giant tail muscles anymore to pull the femur back and move the leg back. So instead, what they've ended up doing is they kind of point their femur forwards, and then it's the muscles from the femur to the lower leg which are doing an awful lot of the pulling. But because birds are fluffy and feathery, you can't see the femur. It's completely hidden under the feathers. So what you're actually seeing is the first bit of leg that comes down, apparently from the chicken or the ostrich or anything else you see. Flamingo's a really good example of this. The joint points backwards because it's not the knee, it's the ankle. And then they've got an enormously long set of foot bones, which to our head looks like a lower leg bone because that's the longest bit of our legs. And then they have their toes. And so that's what's going on. You do
see that in a lot of other animals. Admittedly, like cats and dogs, you see their femur, because obviously they got fur, you can see it. But to be fair, that long foot, they only ever walk on their toes at their back. Their pad isn't their heels up by where their knee should be.
Yeah, and that's it, because we're really rather odd. So we are what is called plantigrade. We walk on the whole foot and the toes. Most animals are digitigrade. They walk on the digits, so they're just walking on the toes and fingers.
Even elephants
Cats,
do that.
Dogs, birds, dinosaurs. Elephants are a slightly weird one because they've got this giant fat pad under the toes, but yes, they're more or less digitigrade. And then you have something called unguligrade, which is walking on tiptoe, so like a ballerina on point. And that's horses. And that, again, is a way of exaggerating the leg length, is that they're now walking, the toe is now adding to the length of the leg because they're running just on the tips.
That's what hooves are, they're fingernails, aren't they?
Yeah, that's exactly what they are. So horses and all the ungulates, so deer and antelope and giraffe and pigs and cows and things are walking, basically on tiptoe to exaggerate the leg length and make them just a little bit faster. But that's what birds are doing. So they're basically running off the femur rather than running off the tail. So that's called knee-driven running because it's the knee effectively producing it. And so, from that perspective, at least, dinosaurs definitely didn't move like birds because birds have got rid of the tail and they've shifted the orientation of large chunks of the leg muscles. to get around that fact. And there are some stumpy-tailed dinosaurs, but they still have tails, bony tails, considerably longer than that of birds, and still have a bunch of tail muscle attached to them. So they're not doing that.
They're not backwardsy. And dinosaurs wouldn't have had them at 90 degrees. They'd have had them lower down because they've got the tail to use the...
Yeah, kind of 25 degrees from vertical kind of thing. I'm not sure we know exactly, but yeah, like the way a lot of animals would stand like that. The knee would point a bit forwards and then the lower leg would point a bit back.
And the ankle.
And then the ankle forwards again, yeah. Flamingos are really great for it. They're occasionally... I've got a really nice photo on my blog somewhere of flamingos sitting down the way we would sit down. And of course their foot bones, or the way we would stand. And of course their foot bones are by far the longest bit of the leg. So there's this bit of the flamingo, which is nearly as long as its body, on the ground. And that's just its foot. That's its little toes at the front, and then this great big long foot bone.
If you put flamingos in shoes, they'd be clown shoes.
Yeah, they're absolutely extraordinary, and they look so alien like that. And yet, no, that's exactly what we do. It's just that they've put that bit down. Quite a few birds will sit like that occasionally. And that's exactly what that theropod resting trace is showing. You've got the metatarsals basically flat against the ground, and quite a few big things do it. I've seen marabou storks do that. And cranes and various other really big birds. It's presumably a useful way of sitting, at least occasionally.
But they obviously don't have their arms out like that. Because they've got wings. They've kind of put them back and they're flat back.
Yeah, so they're all kind of folded back. But also their posture is a bit different because the head and the neck are more upright, and the head's obviously a lot smaller, so there's a lot less weight forwards. And other things, and then they wouldn't have the tail for counterbalance, which is part of the reason the head and neck are up so high. So yeah, they're not going to need to do that.
So that is a load of birds sitting. So why don't you sit back like a flamingo? Because we've got a guest on. It is Dr. Esther Odakunle, and she is here to ask Dave a question or two.
So sorry, speaking on just like the different temperatures and just kind of thinking on the different temperatures across the world. So what was the kind of distribution of dinosaurs across the world? Were they found in like every single continent, or were they where there was just nothing?
Pretty much. So you've got to remember that the distribution of rocks which allows us to find dinosaurs is very uneven, and so there are big tracts of the world with no dinosaurs at all, or big tracts of the world with huge numbers of dinosaurs but from a very specific time. However, on average, there is no reason to think that dinosaurs did not have a truly global distribution for the entirety of the period that they were around. We find them on every continent, including Antarctica. We found them now in something like 150 countries. And there's only something like 240, 220 countries in the world, and many of them are very, very small. There are an awful lot of Luxembourgs and Belgium and Monaco and, all these little principalities. And yet, even so, we still found dinosaurs in over 150 countries, and including places with very, very limited fossils. So Japan and New Zealand, for example, are both mostly volcanic rock, which is not what you want for getting fossils. And yet we have found dinosaurs in New Zealand and in Japan. So they really do turn up absolutely everywhere. In Antarctica, and then northern Canada, southern Argentina, all over Africa, all over Asia, China, India, both sides of Russia, all of Europe. There's stuff in Denmark, I think. There's definitely stuff in the UK, so relatively northern. There's good stuff in Spain and Italy. So,
as a geographer as well, I want to also say that obviously the world didn't look like that. So, like, if you're looking at the Jurassic period, you have like Gondwana, which is like South America and Australia and Antarctica, all in this sort of like massive lump with North America still slightly above it, and Eurasia sort of curling. So it's all a bit, It was a lot easier to get around then as well,
which is another relevant thing. Now if there's something in Europe, and then to get to South America, if you don't swim very, very, very well, you need to go all the way across to Asia, hop across to Alaska, and then go all the way down through north to South America. And a hell of a trek.
It's mad.
And yeah, 100 million years ago, that was a lot easier. 200 million years ago, that was almost trivial. You go straight from England to North America, and then even South America's quite a lot closer and up further.
Simpler times.
Indeed. I mean, you could just walk from Chile to Kenya quite easily. It's all the same landmass.
Yeah. I mean,
and then over to Sydney,
In the late Triassic, pretty much. I mean, by the end of the Cretaceous, so by the time the dinosaurs died out, the continents were not far away from where they are now. India had reconnected, Madagascar was still separate, North and South America were roughly in their current positions, Australia was separate, Antarctica was well separate. So really pretty close. And yet, even so, we see groups that pop up in South America that then pop up in Western Asia. And it's like, well, they probably went through North America to get there, or vice versa. And so we're still clearly getting around. And the swap between, again, it would have been easy. It is not that far across the Bering Strait from Alaska to eastern Russia and China, but we see entire lineages basically hopping backwards and forwards repeatedly over about 50 million years between that junction. So yeah, things absolutely got around.
Okay, this might be a really silly question, but
it might not be. People, we've had lots of people on and people have gone, this sounds really stupid, but you go, actually that's a really interesting question, but people avoid asking because they think it's stupid. So wait until you've asked it and then we'll let you know.
Okay, potentially silly question. Could any dinosaurs swim?
Oh, that's a great question.
It's a really good question. So there's been some fantastic research done on this. So the first thing to say is almost everything could probably swim, in the sense that if you dropped them in water, they would thrash around and propel themselves in the direction in which they intended, because there are very, very, very few animals that can't swim. Giraffe appear to be one of them, and pigs if they're overweight. And after that, the list is very slim indeed.
I'm sorry, imagining an overweight pig.
So apparently things like Vietnamese pot-bellied pigs, because they're really, really fat, and so the little legs basically just can't get any traction in the water, and so they still float. So you got to remember that, unless animals are specifically adapted for diving, so things like hippos and things like whales, you are less dense than water, so you float. You have a big space for your lungs, so if you dunked in water, you will hang around on the surface. There's a very good reason to think that any dinosaur, if dropped in water, would fundamentally be able to propel itself and move around a bit and wouldn't just go glug and sink.
Yeah.
Secondly, we've then got trackways which appear to show this, with feet putting footprints in water, and we know it's underwater because of some of the way the rocks are laid down, and you can see ripple marks and stuff, and those footprints get shallower and shallower and shallower and then disappear, and then start coming back again and get deeper and deeper and deeper in what is interpreted as a river channel. And it is very hard to imagine that that is anything other than an animal wading out to the point that it floats, swimming a bit until its feet start contacting the bottom, and then it walks out the other side. So that's really cool. Then we've got stuff done. There's a paleontologist called Don Henderson, who works in the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, who's really, really clever with 3D modeling and very complicated engineering equations and maths that I don't begin to understand. And Don has built some lovely, accurate 3D models of dinosaurs and calculated in different bone densities and volumes for the lungs and where those lungs sit in the body, and shown basically how they float. So not only do they float or not, and the answer inevitably is they all float because of their lungs, but actually do they float one way up or the other way up? Are they stable? Will they tend to roll over or tip or dip in various ways? And that actually, in some cases, matches footprints. So for some of the big sauropods, we get footprints in water which are just the 4 feet. And Don's model suggests that actually they're slightly front heavy, so they tip. And so if they were free floating in water, the arms would hit the bottom before the legs. And that matches what the footprints show. So that's really good confirmatory evidence. And then finally, there's a couple of dinosaurs which appear to be fairly well adapted to be aquatic. So there's one called Halscaraptor, which was named just a couple of years ago from Mongolia. And that's a little dinosaur that's pretty close to birds, which is kind of swan or grebe or even loon-like. It's got a big, long, flexible neck and really quite weird arms and legs, which make it look like a pretty good swimmer. The other one is Spinosaurus, which there's been a lot of stuff recently suggesting that it's a very good swimmer. I don't think it was anything like as good a swimmer as has been suggested.
I saw a comment on Reddit about it. So Spinosaurus is one of these ones with the big fan on the tail. It's got like a little...
So it's got a big sail on its back, which is the thing most people know.
Some people were asking if that meant it could use it like a sail.
Yeah. No, sticking a 6 foot high bony plate on your back is not a good analogue for sailing ships. Now, Esther, there is an example of a silly question. But yeah, Spinosaurus does also appear to have something of a paddle-like tail, which was just discovered or at least just published in the last few months. Though again, I don't think it's as strong a swimmer as has been suggested. I know I'm not the only one. Lots of people have said that. They're obviously waiting for the... Science takes time, and there's lots more to come on that.
I also need to do a note for people who are going, hang on, and just point out that ichthyosaurs and lizards are not dinosaurs. Am I correct in that?
Well, they are reptiles that are not dinosaurs. So the literal translation of ichthyosaur is fish lizard.
Cool.
But yes, that's a classic misconception, is that basically every big reptile from the Mesozoic is a dinosaur. And so pterosaurs are not dinosaur, and nor are plesiosaurs, pliosaurs, ichthyosaurs. Mesosaurs, mosasaurs, thalassosaucians, and many, many, many other reptile groups are not dinosaurs. But that includes about 12 different lineages of reptiles that were swimming at that time, none of which are dinosaurs. So Hauscaraptor is probably the best candidate for a dinosaur that's a very good swimmer. Until, ironically, actually you get to the birds. So there are birds hanging around in the Cretaceous with dinosaurs, which were really good swimmers. In fact, they were flightless. So there's a thing called Hesperornis or Hesperornis. And yeah, it was a grebe-like swimmer. So it paddled kind of with its legs sideways, kind of doing this very odd alternate-legged breaststroke action.
Literally like one of those toy ducks that you put along behind you.
Yeah.
Nice. Spot on, but massively reduced arms. So
even more like one of those toy ducks.
Yeah, it's a flightless swimming dinosaur. So actually the best aquatic dinosaur from the age of dinosaurs is an early flightless bird, which to me only adds to kind of the puzzle. Because, there's been this idea, which I understand, where people have gone, well, the reason the dinosaurs didn't go back into the water is there's all these other marine reptiles that are kind of filling those niches. There's loads and loads of competition ecologically, and so they probably couldn't do it. Except literally another dinosaur did it. It just happened to be a bird. So it's very odd in some ways that other dinosaurs weren't going in for this. But yes, dinosaurs could swim. Most of them probably couldn't swim well at all. And there were pretty much none which were well-adapted swimmers. You don't have whale equivalents, manatee equivalents, otters, or so many other beavers. We have loads of mammals that have gone back to the water. The dinosaurs, as far as we can tell, mostly didn't.
Sorry, speaking of whales, what is the largest, or what was the largest dinosaur that we
know of?
Can you give me like a scale?
Yeah, roughly. So there's I won't bother rattling off names because there's half a dozen different species, all of which have a credible claim to be the largest ever. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's lots of fighting between paleontologists for each of theirs to be the largest ever. The problem with all of them, of course, is they're massively incomplete. And so there's enough that we can do some scaling and compare them to other species and have a pretty good idea of how big they are, which is why we know they're all about the same size. But you look at the world now, and blue whales are clearly bigger than any other whale. African elephants, though there's probably 2 species of African elephants now, are clearly bigger than anything else. With the dinosaurs, there's a whole bunch that are about the same. And their estimates vary enormously because you're scaling up and there's all kinds of unknowns when you start making animals this big, and they're very incomplete. But I would say at least 70 metric tons is a reasonable weight for any of these animals.
Makes you feel good
which
about
is
bathroom scales, doesn't it?
ludicrous. A big elephant is 5 tons. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And even kind of the lower estimates, so the lower estimates which bring those numbers down considerably, the higher medium end of them is still around 50 tons or so. Wow. So I don't think anyone thinks that the biggest dinosaurs didn't reach 50 tons.
So how big were the baby dinosaurs then?
Well, that's the fun thing, tiny, because you can't make giant eggs and they're not giving birth to live young. So, yeah, if you had a 70-ton elephant would be giving birth to a 10 or 15-ton baby. But dinosaurs can't do that. So even a 70-ton dinosaur is still laying an egg that's football-sized, maybe a bit bigger, that's 5, 6, 7 kilos. So tiny.
Yeah.
But they grow quick.
Yeah, but even then, for a long time, you're effectively going from potentially 7 kilos to 70 tons.
That's wild.
So that's a 10,000-fold increase.
That's wild.
Exactly. I mean, the amount of food they must have had to have eaten. So, Esther, did Dave answer your question satisfactorily?
He did.
Hooray!
Great job, thank you.
There we go. That's all we wanted.
Wait, hold on. One more question.
Come on.
I am still recording.
Speed up. I'm still recording too. Let's go.
Okay, so random, but did dinosaurs see in colour?
Yes, and they're actually tetrachromatic. So they've got a UV sensitive cell, which we don't. So they could actually see better colours than we could.
Oh my God, wow.
Which is normal. So birds, most reptiles, and even a whole bunch of fish do this.
How do we know that, Dave?
I didn't even know that.
Well, so again, we don't know. It's a classic. We don't know that as 100% surety, but basically all birds do that, and all reptiles do that, and I think almost all amphibians do that.
So it'd be weird
Mammals
if they
are
didn't.
very much the deviation from this pattern. There is no reason to think that dinosaurs did not do this. And the reason mammals have deviated so much is because we almost certainly went through a fully nocturnal phase, where what you're more interested in is black and white sensitivity, and you don't really care about color. And so they lost the color vision, and then it was later reacquired only in primates, and only the diurnal primates. So lots of lemurs, lots of galagos, bush babies, things like this, which are still nocturnal, still don't have that. And it's only the diurnal primates who are around in broad daylight with bright colors, and in particular tend to do things like eat fruit, where suddenly distinguishing colors, and in particular reds, is quite important. Yeah. And so there's a reason that it's the monkeys and apes that have this, but they probably reacquired this relatively recently, and UV isn't really important for us. And so, yeah, we just don't have it. But there's no reason, therefore, to think that dinosaurs didn't, because it's probably very useful for them, and indeed all their relatives before and after have it.
Wow, thank you.
So a big thank you to Dr. Esther. You can find her on Twitter at ESTODEK.
But were not dinosaurs. They went are the flying reptiles that lived alongside dinosaurs but were not dinosaurs. They went extinct with the dinosaurs, and they appeared probably about the same time as part of this big radiation of reptiles in the middle to late Triassic period. So they're almost certainly very close relatives of dinosaurs, and in particular this paper that just came out a month or two ago suggests that they are closest to a group called the Largopatids.
The Largopatids, the drinking dinosaurs.
Yes, the drunk ones. Well, again, not dinosaurs. So immediately prior to the origin of the group that we would call dinosaurs, where on a big family evolutionary tree we'd draw a line, say everything past this point is dinosaurs. There's a bunch of other little groups. Little in the terms of we don't have too many animals, and little in the sense that they weren't very big. You know, animals maybe a couple of meters long total, including the tail, a lot of them half that size. Small little bipedal reptiles, mostly little carnivores, running around doing little carnivore-y things. We don't need to get into all the details of these groups, but the Largopatids are one of those groups, and it now looks pretty likely that they and the pterosaurs are very close relatives. So pterosaurs are probably what we officially would say are a sister, so they're the nearest relative to the Largopatids, and together that group actually sits just outside of dinosaurs. So pterosaurs are very closely related to dinosaurs, and they show a huge number of features which we would associate with dinosaurs, but they are not them.
Okay. And this is obviously, when we say pterosaurs, everybody knows what a pterodactyl is. That is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But there are more than pterodactyls, because there are some massive ones.
And pterodactyl is itself a problematic term. I know some academics who still use that term. I know some academics who absolutely despise that term. I'm closer to that side of things than the other. And that comes down to a kind of historical quirk, because actually the first pterosaur specimens discovered predate the dinosaurs by about 50 years.
Oh, wow.
And the first one was eventually named Pterodactylus, and was, before it had been given the formal scientific name of Pterodactylus, was called pterodactyl. And this was named by the famous French anatomist Baron Cuvier, and Cuvier called it the pterodactyl, and then later kind of formalised that to pterodactylus. And so that's where the idea that pterosaurs should be called pterodactyls comes from. But it's not the correct name for them, and often people use the term pterodactyl to refer to Pterodactylus and its near relatives. So part of the reason that I don't like using pterodactyl is some people in their heads would picture any random pterosaur, and some people would picture a very specific pterosaur, and it's like, that's a really bad way of dealing with this thing. So the safest thing to do is just not use it. So yes, what people will have heard of as pterodactyls, for most people, we just mean pterosaur, and pterosaur is the better word to use, in my opinion. And they're really diverse. So again, people have probably heard of Pteranodon, they've probably heard of pterodactyl or Pterodactylus, they've probably heard of Quetzalcoatlus, which is one of the really big ones from North America.
That's a massive one. It's scary.
It's one of the massive ones. There's a bunch that size. And then they're probably kind of running out. But pterosaurs, there's at least 150 species named, probably actually closer to 200 these days. They lived for just as long as the dinosaurs did, so 150, 60 million years. They were on every continent. They're much rarer than dinosaurs because their bones are so unbelievably thin and fragile. And so their fossil record is very poor, but they were almost certainly present in huge numbers. You know, we're just not finding them because they didn't preserve rather than they were rare animals. Because when the preservation conditions are right, they are present in huge numbers. And so their diversity and other things were almost certainly much greater than we recognise. But still, most people could name 4 or 5 at a real push, and there's a couple of hundred. And they span everything from about a metre in wingspan to 10 metres plus in wingspan at adult.
That's ridiculous, 10 metres. That's massive.
Yeah, so I mean, the standard thing is, you know, fighter planes, a small private jet, not even like a little hobby pilot has, you know, 1 propeller, 2 seat.
Not like a little tiger moth biplane.
No, even that's 6-7 metres. We're talking significantly bigger than that.
It's ridiculous that these things... Okay, and so they got... The reason you had such big things in the air was because they had the hollow bones, like dinosaurs had hollow bones.
So there's a combination of factors that allowed even the very big pterosaurs to fly. I mean, the first thing we should say is that these were all pterosaurs that we know of were true powered flyers. There's this idea that they could only glide. They had to jump off a cliff or jump off a tree or use wind to get height. No, these were proper powered flyers. These are not flying squirrels or flying lizards like animals that basically have to go down. They could stand on the ground, jump into the air and fly and flap, basically. So partly, yes, they're hollow bones, and they're extraordinary hollow bones. I mean, these big pterosaurs we're talking about, these animals with 10-meter wingspans, some of the big bones in like the neck and the arm, they're 98+% air by volume.
Wow.
Like, that thin cardboard that you get, the slightly plasticky stuff that you get often on the lids of takeaway meals and stuff like that.
No, I don't. I eat healthily, Dave. I'm not like you.
It's not paper, but it's cardboard, that thin cardboard, or that you get in when you buy a shirt in M&S and there's a sheet cardboard. So much thicker than a piece of paper, but much thinner than what you'd normally consider a cardboard box. That's how thick the bone is.
So literally these massive creatures, you could crush them. You just poke your finger through them almost.
So what it's got inside is tons of tiny little spaghetti-like struts.
Okay.
So it's super, super thin-walled, but it has a whole bunch of support in it.
Okay.
We're talking about bones that might be 1 metre long, and that's how thick they were.
So if our bones are like Mars bars or Snickers bars or marathons, they're crunchies.
I mean, there's so much more in a crunchy than there is in a pterosaur bone. I mean, extraordinary levels of bone reduction. And that's part of it, but that only explains so much. Now, there'd also then be, so the air sacs, we've talked about air sacs in dinosaurs and birds and that would connect to the lungs and other bits of the body. They'd have that too. So it's not just that the bones are hollow, big bits of the body would have these big air cavities in them. So in other words, these very big animals are a lot less heavy than they look. But the other reason that in particular the big ones can fly is that when they take off, they're taking off with their arms. Birds actually do a terrible job of flying in some ways, and one of them is the way they take off. So when pretty much any bird takes off, what it does is it either runs or jumps into the air with its legs and then starts flying.
Or if they're a swan, goes for ages along the water.
Right, and they're flapping the whole time. That's actually a terrible way of getting into the air, because these are flying animals. They have massive flying muscles, and yet they're not using them to start the launch. So what they actually then have to do is have relatively big, heavy legs to have the power to jump into the air. And then they're lugging around the dead weight of those heavy legs when they fly. This is a bad combination. What pterosaurs do, and actually what bats do, is they have tiny, spindly little legs with almost no muscle in them, which are just there to help them walk around and be stable because they walk on all fours. But when they start to fly, when they launch, they're basically pushing off the ground and jumping with their wings, the things with the massive flight muscles on them, which is a very sensible way of launching into the air. Actually, the best analogy I can give is there's this awful Soviet-era fighter called the Yak, and the Yak was supposed to be the competitor to the Harrier in that it was supposed to be a vertical takeoff jet. But because they never developed the way of getting the thrust vectored, they basically put an entire second engine in this that's only job was to lift it up and down. And then, of course, when it's trying to fly normally, it's got the weight of an entire extra engine on it, which meant that it kind of sucked doing both. That's what birds are. Whereas pterosaurs and bats are a Harrier. They've got one engine and they use it to take off and then they use it to fly.
Now, what confuses me, and we're getting a bit off subject already, but I want to, I just confuse. You mentioned
we're on to Soviet-era fighters from the 70s. I think we're already somewhat off topic.
I'm happy with that. I'm happy with yaks. We're good with that. Do they have pink milk? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Would there be, in the late Cretaceous, just before the KT extinction, a time when you could look up in the sky and you could see a bat, you could see a pterosaur, and you could see a bird?
Maybe.
Wow.
So there's this big idea that birds basically outcompeted pterosaurs, and that's really poorly supported. Birds and pterosaurs were around for about 100 million years together. So if birds were outcompeting pterosaurs, they did a very bad job of it. And they certainly hadn't succeeded by the KT extinction. So there were loads of birds and pterosaurs around together. Birds may well have outcompeted some of the smaller pterosaurs, but even then, pterosaurs, like dinosaurs, would have been independent very young. We have excellent reason to think that baby pterosaurs were flying soon after they hatched. So you've then got the position of like, okay, I can see how a crow-sized bird was not in competition with, say, a 5 or 6 meter wingspan pterosaur. But the babies of those pterosaurs would have been bird-sized, and so would have been occupying, potentially at least, the same space and trying to eat the same prey in the same way. And so birds clearly weren't outcompeting them, otherwise the adults would never have survived because they never have got to adult. So birds and pterosaurs, overlap enormously. Bats, we don't know. So the earliest bats, I want to say bats are obviously not my thing. The earliest bats I want to say are about 62 million years old, something like that.
About 3 million years out.
So within a few million years of the end of the dinosaurs, and they're really very batty. By what I mean is that they're not some kind of proto-bat with sort of wings but long fingers, but not. No, it's a bat. It's clearly got a few more little things, but it's 90% of the way there. And so the long-standing question, my understanding would be, again, not a mammologist, don't do bat fossils, you've got an either-or. Either bats evolved really fast after the mass extinction to get like fully bat within a couple of million years, or they were knocking around in the Cretaceous and we just haven't found them, and then they survived the mass extinction. And it's one of those ones where neither of those looks too plausible. So which is it?
Both are wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe a bat was transported back in time as a fossil.
It's a really nice, annoying thing where either way the answer is absolutely fascinating. This is either stunningly quick evolution or incredible survival and a bad fossil record. And it's like, ugh. I mean, my money would be on the rapid evolution. You've just had a mass extinction. You've wiped out loads of flying things. There's lots of eco space to explore for small mammally things. That might be a good time to start evolving flight, so to speak. But I think it is a non-zero possibility that there could have been Cretaceous skies with all 3 vertebrate-powered flyers in the same time and space.
That's pretty cool. So let's go back to pterodactyls. No, not pterodactyls, because that makes you angry.
Pterosaurs.
Pterosaurs. Not going to make him angry, everybody. It's going to be fine. So, pterosaurs, talk to me about, what's it called? Quetzalcoatl.
Quetzalcoatlus. So Quetzalcoatlus is like the kind of archetypal giant pterosaur. So this is the one which we're pretty confident has a wingspan of 10 meters plus, weighed somewhere between 250 and 350 kilos, which on the one hand is extraordinarily heavy for a flying animal.
But compared to a plane of equal size, is nothing.
But on the other hand, it's extremely lightweight indeed. So the standard drawing, which is entirely kosher, is a Quetzalcoatl standing next to a giraffe. And they have big heads and great big long necks and little bodies with great big long legs. They're actually vaguely giraffe proportioned. And a giraffe that size weighs 800-900 kilos, a heavy male, 1.5 tons. So, to be somewhere between a third and a fifth of that weight whilst being roughly the same size, and in some dimensions being much bigger because they've got much, much bigger head.
Yeah, their heads are weird, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, a Quetzalcoatlus, the head is about 2.5 meters long, the neck is about 2.5 meters long, and then the body, the actual, chest cavity, is about the same, well, not much bigger than mine.
Wow. And he doesn't have a 2.5 metre long chest, ladies and gents.
Yeah, and I'm all right, it's actually a fair bit bigger than that, but what I mean is, not absurdly bigger than a big human.
Wow.
Certainly not like an elephant, which you might expect for an animal that's these kinds of dimensions. And then an awful lot of wings.
Talk to me about the head. It didn't have a beak, but did it have a beak? I mean, I sort of see them, because I'm remembering, I'm looking at bits of paleo art that I see, and also, I don't know very much about them. they look a bit like herons.
Yeah, so in that regard, the heads are really quite heron-like. It is a
or a stork if you don't know what a heron is.
It is a big, long, pointy head. Basically,
attack you with my face.
Really, all it is.
My face.
And Quetzalcoatlus and indeed the rest of its group, these are called the Azhdarchids. They're found all over the place. So I've named one from Canada. There's stuff from North America.
What did you name it? Do you remember what you called it?
Cryodracon, the
nice.
frozen dragon.
That's pretty cool.
But there's a bunch from Russia, from Mongolia. There's quite a bit from France, actually, and down in Romania. So they're certainly all over the northern hemisphere. I'm sure they're down south and we just haven't found them yet. But yeah, they've all got these great big long spike-like heads, and the interpretation of their biology is very stork-like, or at least some of the more terrestrial storks. And hornbills, or some of the big ground hornbills, are a kind of good analogy. They're basically wandering around in these relatively open environments. They're probably taking stuff near water when they can, but they're fundamentally terrestrial, and they're just grabbing and swallowing lizards and baby dinosaurs and probably mammals and snakes and
birds,
whatever else they can. Yeah, and they probably scavenged a bit if they could and found a big dead dinosaur. There was an idea for a long time that they were dedicated vulture-like scavengers, which we're very confident that they weren't. There was an idea that they were truly heron-like and standing in water and fishing. They probably did that,
legs.
But that's not their... They've got great big long legs.
Oh, do they?
These ones. Yeah. So this is what I say, giraffe-like proportions, really long legs and really long forelimbs as well.
More like bat legs at the back, but I know they had the big long arms, which they used to fly.
The Azhdarchids specifically have very long legs as well, which is one of the reasons they're very terrestrial. So they could still, as I say, jump and fly very happily, but we think they're probably walking around a lot. That's fundamentally what they're doing. So ground hornbills, for people who know them, you get the kind of red-faced ones in southern Africa. They turn up on, if you've ever been on safari down there, you've probably seen them, but they turn up on documentaries periodically. That's what they do. They walk around in this long grass, and they're basically going after little lizards and mice and eggs and stuff like that. But of course,
it's got to be really long. I'm sorry, but that's
and then, but if trouble comes along, or the place they're in really isn't very good, or they need to get to some water, they just take off. But they're not flying. So that's what we think the Azhdarchids at least were probably doing. The flip side of that is something like Pteranodon. Big pteranodons are looking at 7+ meter wingspan. So these are, again, big. Not small pterosaur. You go, oh, well, the difference between 7 and 10 meters is colossal. And it is. But 7 meters is also still absolutely massive. And Pteranodon is a proper, albatross-like pterosaur. It's way out to sea. It probably doesn't see land for days, weeks, months at a time, potentially. And, hyper flyer, really good in the air and living out the ocean and taking fish.
Okay, you're going to have to explain to me how you can tell that one isn't a scavenger and the other spends days out at sea just from a skeleton, or a fossil, sorry.
Azhdarchids don't actually show kind of scavenger-like heads. That beak is really good for striking at stuff. It's really not very good for ripping chunks of dead dinosaur off. So that's the first one. The second thing is they're really good at walking, which is not what you want to be as a vulture-like scavenger. You want super efficient flying transport. Why do you need these great big long legs to walk everywhere? That's a very bad way of getting around and finding food. In the case of Pteranodon, some of the proportions, that in particular, actually, Pteranodon has fairly short legs. That changes the wing shape. We should talk about that in a minute as well. But the main reason that we think Pteranodon lives miles out to sea a lot is, so almost all the Pteranodon material comes out of Kansas. There used to be a giant inland sea in what is now the continental US. So imagine basically an almost C-shaped ring of modern America, and all of the middle was an ocean. And we know roughly where the then coastline was. And basically all the Pteranodon stuff comes anything between 100 and 200 or 300 miles from that coastline.
Wow. They could just be the failed Pteranodons who got lost that's where they died.
We find them in huge numbers. So they were out there in very large numbers. And 100 miles from the coastlines, so they're flying. We also found a bunch of pteranodons with fish in them, and the flip side of that is I helped describe a pteranodon neck with a shark tooth wedged in it. Ooh. So these are reasons to think that they're going out to sea quite a bit.
That's quite exciting. Okay, let's talk about their wings though, because all that big wing, I think we might have said before somewhere, or at least you've told me this, so it might not have been recorded. But that is their little finger.
It's their ring finger. So pterosaurs basically have 4 digits. So when you look at a pterosaur hand, it has 3 fingers that we call them the free fingers because they can move and wiggle about. And then the giant finger that they're flying off actually bends in the opposite direction, so 180 degrees out. So if you curl your 3 fingers flat onto your palm, you want your other finger to go literally fold back the opposite direction.
Ow!
Yes.
Don't do this at home, kids.
It's a really quite neat piece of evolution where they've basically entirely rotated that joint 180 degrees, so it folds in the opposite direction to the rest of the fingers.
So they couldn't make a fist. Or if they did it...
Only with the first 3.
Yeah, and the other one will sort of fold back on itself the wrong way.
Yeah. And so that's the spar, it's the leading edge. And then from that, there is a giant membrane which attaches from the tip of that wing all the way down to the ankles. And we're very confident of that. And I wrote with some colleagues a paper that established this.
Is there a little hook or something that shows a bit of, on their ankles, is there a bit of membrane attachment bone?
No, there isn't, but we've got enough fossils where the membrane preserves, where you can see it going down there. So this is a weird thing about pterosaurs. So as I said, their fossil record on the one hand is terrible because their bones are so thin they don't preserve very well. On the other hand, when the preservation is exceptional, and this is actually similar, indeed the same places we get a lot of the feathered dinosaurs, well, the pterosaurs are preserved just as well, and things like their wing membranes are nice and thin, and they also preserve. So yeah, we have a bunch of complete articulated pterosaurs with wing membranes. We've got them with a like pelican-like throat pouch. We've got them with little webbed toes. We have the other thing we've got is they have what are called pycnofibers. Which
are not feathers and not fur.
This is another huge question, which is part of the reason that pterosaur origins are very interesting. They are simple, thin filaments, just like the simple, thin filaments we get on early feathered dinosaurs, and like some of these simple, thin filaments that we get on some of the ornithischian dinosaurs, which, again, may or may not be feathered. And so this is this huge question of, did that single filament originate before dinosaurs and then was inherited by pterosaurs and the ornithischians and the theropods and then lost in various individual groups? Or has that evolved twice? Or has that evolved even 3 times? We don't know. So for some people call pterosaur filaments feathers. I think that's not a good thing. It might be correct, but we don't know it's correct. So I think for now it's easier and better to call them pycnofibers. And if they ever turn out to be truly identical to feathers, absolutely we need to change that and call them feathers. But until we know that, I think it's safer to call them something else.
Okay.
Because that's avoiding making an extra assumption.